Hello, and welcome to the Whale Hunting Podcast, where we shine a light onto hidden worlds of money and power. I'm Bradley Hope, and earlier this week I was joined by my Project Brazen co-founder, Tom Wright. Together we wrote Billion Dollar Whale about the 1MDB scandal, and today we're going to be discussing all the latest updates from the story, from new convictions to confiscated cash. Let's get started.
All right, Bradley, I'm very excited to be back in the studio with you. It's been quite a while since you and I have sat down together.
Yes, usually only on Signal.
Yeah, well, we're on Signal every day discussing things and people and money movements around the world. But today we wanted to talk about, we always talk about 1MDB. It's a never-ending saga. This story broke in 2015, happened over a decade ago, billions stolen, Hollywood movies made, all of the stuff that our regular listeners know about. And we actually wanted to get together to talk about the fact that Switzerland had finally jailed somebody in this, despite tons of the money moving via Switzerland. And we wanted to bring everyone up to date on that. But before we do so, there's been a bombshell article in a Malaysian newspaper, The Star. And why don't you tell us what it says? And let's talk about that first.
Well, basically, in Malaysia, there's all these lawsuits that are continuing. There's people interviewed every day. There's, they're digging into some of the really specific transactions. So today, for the first time, they disclosed that about $2.4 million from 1MDB flowed into the pockets of Pharrell Williams and Kim Kardashian and her ex-husband at that time. And these are not utterly shocking revelations, but it's really nice to see the specifics, the details, because it's no longer sort of implied. Like we knew that Kim Kardashian was in receipt of benefits from Jho Low, but we never saw the exact number and the exact flow. And the same thing goes for Pharrell, right?
Yeah, well, let's talk a bit about what we said in Billion Dollar Whale about Pharrell Williams. So, and first of all, let's just explain that the Malaysian government, 1MDB itself, which still exists as an entity, is continuing to investigate to try to get monies back. So this is how big this fraud was. A fraud exposed almost 10 years ago, including by us, and then still people are trying to find the money. And a tiny, tiny part of it is $2 million went to Pharrell Williams, who, of course, the hip hop artist, who is now, I think, what is he? He's the head of design at Louis Vuitton. Is that right?
Yeah, it's like creative director or something like that.
Creative director of Louis Vuitton. Anyway, so Pharrell, Jho Low, with all this money he'd stolen, billions of dollars, he at that time, and we're talking about, I think, 2011, he's dating a Taiwanese pop star called Elva Xiao. And our listeners might remember Elva Xiao was the woman that he serenaded in Dubai with this ridiculous party where they sat on the beach by themselves and some good-looking models helicoptered in with chopard jewelry for her. And it was mistakenly reported, even by us, I think, at one point as a proposal of marriage, but it wasn't. It was just like a Friday night dinner or something.
It was like way over the top romantic. There was lots of like "I love you" and like made of candles and roses. And those guys didn't ride on helicopters; they parachuted wearing tuxedos, carrying boxes of jewelry. So
they parachuted out of a helicopter though,
okay,
and landed at the Palm Jumeirah where Jho Low was sitting, and it just looked like the most excruciatingly bad. In the film version of Billion Dollar Whale that's coming, I hope that's going to be a scene because that's. That for me is a purely comic moment. But anyway, Elva Xiao, the woman who he didn't marry and broke up with, she was a pretty well-known Taiwanese Mandarin language pop star. And Jho Low went to Pharrell because she, like many Asian pop stars, wanted to break into the English language market. And I think the proposition to Pharrell was, hey, look, here's $2 million. Can you create a bunch of songs for her? And help, or at least consult in some way to make Elva a bona fide American pop star. So I think that's what was going on.
There was a bit of a history with Pharrell too, because I think Pharrell showed up at the graduation party of Nuriana Najib, the daughter of Najib and Rasma, in this like posh boarding school, Seven Oaks. He was there. And then also Jho used to brag out loud to people that he, quote, owned a piece of Pharrell. So whatever that meant, that he was an investor or whatever it could be. But there was definitely like a pretty strong connection, especially during the early days.
Well, he was always saying things like that. There was that famous night in Alicia Keys and Swizz Beatz recording studio where he calls Busta Rhymes his bitch because he's just become the chairman of EMI Music Publishing Asia, and I think that was Busta Rhymes. And Pharrell was actually in the room at that time and tries to make small talk to cover over the fact that Jho Low's just called Busta Rhymes a bitch, which was like didn't go down well at all. So Pharrell was definitely around, and I mean, of course, this was the time when Jho Low got someone to write them a terrible song, a terrible one of those awful 2000 club songs where his sole role is to go. Jho Low's role is to go. What is he? It's hot.
It's hot.
Very, very hot.
So hot.
Very, very. Yeah. Is that song publicly available?
No, I don't think that song ever came out. But there is a song that was in the soundtrack of 21 Jump Street where it says, "I see you, Jho Low," and then it refers to like black miso.
Drinking shots. No, I see you, Jho Low, drinking shots, never solo.
Yeah, so he had
Seabass miso, me se loco. I think there's something
really, really terrible. Maybe we can sample it.
There was a lot of terrible songs around. They all remind me of LMFAO. Those kind of those kind of songs. But we should. By the way, we should make that song available to whale hunting subscribers somehow. Maybe on the show notes we can. Yeah, we can do that. A link to the Dropbox.
But but Jho Low was so tight with all of those, with a lot of singers at that time, and some of them were the ones that were kind of in their sunset period. So there was like Nelly, remember that rapper, and like these guys that they saw him as the last great paycheck that they were gonna get because they were going out of fashion, but Jho Low was still into them, and I remember even like long after 1MDB blew up, Nelly and a bunch of those rappers showed up in Thailand for a special party that he hosted, if you remember.
Yeah, on the banks of the Chao Phraya River. We should say, of course, Pharrell's incredibly successful and doesn't fit into that category you just described. I mean, he's really one of the best, in my view, one of the best songwriters of my generation. I mean, I love the Neptunes, I love him, and that's what's so amazing about this 1MDB story, is that how did Jho Low get in with someone like that? I guess
it all came from the nightclubs. It all came from the nightclubs. That's how he met everybody. Because he was hanging out, spending at that time like $100,000 a night, and he started meeting all these promoters, and they in turn introduced him to everybody else. That was what it was all about, and everybody was excited about Jho Low because here was a guy that didn't negotiate for weeks over a contract. He said, "Okay, how much is it going to cost? Okay, let's do it. $2 million." And that was amazing. It was uncommon.
Yeah, and as you said, all those. Characters, a lot of those characters ended up partying with him in Bangkok on the Chao Phraya River, even after the stories had come out about him. I think the woman who was the lead singer of the Pussycat Dolls, who's now the
Nicole Scherzinger. She was always there.
Nicole Scherzinger.
Yeah, she was always there.
Yeah, she was always there. Okay, so let's move on quickly to Kim Kardashian. So you mentioned her. I mean, I think the reason we found out about Kim Kardashian was when Chris Humphries, her husband, who was an NBA player, they were married for a very few number of days. And Jho Low went to their wedding and gave them a white Ferrari, I think it was, or white Lamborghini, white Ferrari, I'm pretty certain. And then they got divorced a few days or weeks later. And then in the sort of fight over the who got what out of the marriage, Chris Humphries says, "Well, I want that white Ferrari from the Malaysian businessman," and that's how we knew it must be Jho Low, because that had come out without his name, I think, in the U.S. media. So that was Kim Kardashian. And what does the news story say about Kim Kardashian? And
it refers to two different transactions. One of them is $300,000, and one of them is $100,000. So in addition to that car, the luxury gift, he also was just paying cash, and clearly that was to attend gatherings or parties of his. Because and this was one of the secrets of Hollywood that people don't really appreciate, maybe, is that when you see people at these parties or on yachts, it's transactional. They're not always there because they want to be there or it's like their friend. They're being paid to show up. So it is like eye candy, sort of like bring prestige to events. So Joe is all about that, especially in those early days. He loved it. He went from having maybe millions of dollars of of somewhat shady money to suddenly having $1 billion, right? Or 700 million at that particular time, but later that year, it rose to $1 billion. So he had 700 million in cash in a Coots bank account to just spend however he wanted. And he just went on a crazy spending spree. And this is actually just the smallest expenditure, 2.4 million on a couple of celebrities. This was like all in a week's work for him, and he was living in the $100,000 a month apartment, traveling around in a fleet of Escalades around New York. This was like the most carefree, fun part for Jho was at this point in time.
Okay, we need to talk about what Switzerland's done, and we will do that. But first of all, we'll be right back after this break. All right, Bradley, so tell me, what has finally happened in Switzerland after we've had to wait almost a decade for them to take any action in the 1MDB case?
Well, the interesting thing about Switzerland is when we were covering 1MDB, we were sort of shocked when one day the Swiss prosecution put out a press release saying they were investigating 1MDB. And also the FBI did that in New York as well. They said they put out a statement to us that they were investigating Goldman Sachs and 1MDB. And it was, I think, on both sides, I think there was a reason for it. On the FBI side, they wanted to bring whistleblowers. They wanted people to start showing up with information. In the Swiss side, they wanted to almost put themselves accountable because the Swiss are historically terrible at prosecuting white-collar crime. Obviously, historically, it was like a secrecy jurisdiction, no different than like the BVI. And then they've been trying to clean up their image, and this was like one of the biggest cases that ever came across their team, and they were putting themselves out there saying they were going after it. But the truth is, most investigative agencies around the world, law enforcement, have no budget to really pursue these complex international frauds and white-collar crimes. And also, they don't really have the courage to pursue it across borders either. They kind of want to just focus on their own country. So the Swiss didn't really do very much for a long time. And there was some scandal where even the attorney general that was pursuing the case had some conflicts of interest that came out that made it also complicated. So then there was a new prosecutor who finally put this case, started taking it forward.
Let's just take a step back and explain how does this 1MDB fraud, which obviously involves stealing money from a Malaysian sovereign wealth fund and spending it mainly in the US and the UK, how did it touch Switzerland?
So the first phase of the 1MDB fraud was Malaysia. 1MDB borrowed money from Malaysian banks, about $1 billion, and Jho completely controlled 1MDB, although by this point he had no official role there, no like executive power. He just controlled all of the individuals there. And they all thought to some extent that he was just the conduit from the prime minister. But it turns out later on we learned that Jho was just running his own show. Like the prime minister was also involved, but Jho was the one controlling 1MDB. So he wanted to get access to that $1 billion right away. And so what they did is he hooked up with these guys. So there was this company called Petro Saudi. And in reality, Petro Saudi was just a nameplate company. It had no real assets of any kind. It was just a prominent Saudi prince and like his sort of shady guy that helped him make money. Because even princes need to make money. They have allowances and they have their tastes exceed those allowances. So this was just a company that you would hire to like have the imprimatur of the prince of Saudi Arabia involved or whatever. But Jho and the team behind it.
And supposedly an oil company. I mean,
it was called Petro Saudi. It was called Petro Saudi.
It was supposed to be prospecting for oil around the world with a Saudi prince involved, right?
But in reality, they didn't want to do any actual work like that. So Jho met these guys and they cooked up. They must have immediately found some shortcut to understanding that we all want to make a lot of money without doing a lot of work. And Jho has access to this $1 billion, and they have this kind of what looks like a shiny looking company. So the way it worked was very simply, they agreed to do a joint venture where Malaysia was going to contribute money and this Petro Saudi was going to contribute assets. Instead of actually having assets, they went around spending very little money optioning assets and then saying that they own them, and then they were going to contribute them together. So one of the crazy things that happened was in the paperwork it said, here's the joint venture. However, we're only sending $300 million there. We're going to send the rest of the money over here to this company called Good Star. And Good Star was kind of the foundational first fraudulent company in the 1MDB scandal. And Good Star was owned by Jho Low.
Now, Petro Saudi had this layabout Saudi prince as a name, but it was actually run by these two guys who lived in Geneva, right? Who knew each other from boarding school, international school in Geneva, Tariq Obaid and Patrick Mahoney. And so these are the two guys who finally have gone to jail. So what was their role in all of this? You just explained how they helped steal this first 700 million.
They haven't gone to jail. They've been sentenced to prison, but now they have the opportunity to appeal. So they're not in prison now. So Tariq Obaid was the son of a Saudi kind of former arms dealer type who had made a lot of money, moved his family to Switzerland, and then lost a lot of money, and then he passed away. And so then the children were left to try to rebuild the family fortune. And so Tariq has no particular skills other than he was kind of a networker, and Patrick was sort of the brains of Petro Saudi. He was a very talented financial executive investor type person, and so he played that role.
I think he'd worked at Goldman previously, hadn't he?
Yeah, a few different places. Yeah, Ashmore I think was one of the places. And anyway, So this 700 million, this huge chunk of cash went to Goodstar instead of into this joint venture, and actually I think it was Deutsche Bank compliance officers were like, this doesn't make sense, and they raised a lot of questions. But because Jho so fully controlled 1MDB, he was able to overcome the compliance concerns. He flew over the entire team of 1MDB, the CEO and the general counsel, to, I think, Switzerland to make the case. No, this is exactly what we want to do. We know what we're doing. This is what we're going to do. And as soon as that was cleared, it took a couple of weeks, I think, then suddenly Jho had access to all this money, just pure cash,
Yeah. So they were the foundational co-conspirators in helping Jho steal that money, and then they went also on to live the high life, right? Both of them, Patrick Mahoney and Patrick.
And also, so it started off with essentially stealing this $1 billion, but eventually the same mechanism was used to take $1.8 billion. So it was a pretty big chunk of the $7 billion fraud, although it became bigger later, and they found an even more shady collaborator in Abu Dhabi called Khadim Al-Kubaisi. But and the other thing that's kind of fun about this first phase is this first phase was a kind of undoing for 1MDB because they wanted to. So this was a joint venture, $1.8 billion, but they kept changing what it was. It started off as a joint venture. Then it became like a debt. Then eventually it became these shares in this company and the Cayman Islands. And every auditor of 1MDB was like, this doesn't make sense. I need to see the underlying assets. And so they changed their auditor 3 times. And this was actually really important in the early days of our 1MDB reporting, which was the financial statements showed that they were really trying to hide what was in this mysterious box that they said was now worth $2.3 billion.
Like you said, they didn't. Like you said, they didn't do any oil investments. They just stole the money using this as a front. And there's a brilliant moment in the emails which we got hold of where they're all sort of stressing about, hey, look, Jho, you've taken out all this hundreds of millions of dollars, and at some point we're going to have to do some business here to actually, cover the holes. And I think at one point it's either Patrick or Tariq says, oh, don't worry, Jho's told us he's just going to get Najib, the prime minister, to write it off. So this is this ridiculous world these guys were living in. It's like just steal hundreds of millions of Malaysian money, pretend you're doing an oil business, you're not really, live the high life, party, boats. I think at one point Patrick Mahoney was dating Lindsay Lohan, right? Remember that? Or at least there were photos of Lindsay Lohan on the boat with him. They're hanging with all these celebrities, and they just say, oh, we're just going to get the Prime Minister of Malaysia to write all this off. No, it won't be an issue. Yeah,
one of the big mistakes that was made was they were all using BlackBerry Messenger to communicate, which at that time was kind of like the Signal of nowadays. It was the most encrypted form of chat conversation. But because they were having separate conversations with Jho, they needed to share the transcripts of those chats. So they copied and pasted the transcript of the BBM messages into an email. Later on, because of Xavier Justo, the entire email archive was leaked. And so that's where those things were found, where they were saying these extremely damning things, like, "Listen, you don't talk to our guy, we won't talk to your guy." All this sort of language that made it absolutely crystal clear.
Xavier Justo, of course, is the whistleblower in the 1MDB case. He worked for Petro Saudi, and he ended up taking, when he left the company, he ended up taking the email servers, and then they became part of the original release to Claire Rucastle Brown at the Sarawak Report. And that's how the first stories about Goodstar came out, right? Because of Justo. There's also a great moment in Billion Dollar Whale where Justo is trying to figure out what to do, and he meets Mahoney, Patrick Mahoney. I think he's in his early 30s by this point, in Bangkok at a hotel on the river, and another hotel on the river in Bangkok. And Mahoney threatens him, right? He says, "I don't like how this is going to end. I think this is going to end with the destruction of you." And it was his basically threat to Justo, "Look, if you release these emails from Petro Saudi," which he ended up doing, "then I will destroy you." And so there's a lot of Patrick Mahoney in the book. There's another bit I want to quickly read. This is when he's talking to Justo's wife, Laura. And Justo ends up getting arrested in Thailand because these guys will kind of conspire to get him arrested after he's leaked these emails, right? Because they want to paint him as a bad actor, and the emails are doctored, they're not true. And he's trying to get Justo's wife, Laura, to help. And he says, "Can you just say this is all fake, basically, and Claire Rucastle Brown at the Sarawak Report is making it up?" And she says, "But are there any guarantees that Justo will get out of jail if I do this?" And he basically says, "It's all just money." And then he says, "We're in the shit. We're all deep in the shit. There's a prime minister of a country who's also in the shit." I mean, it's just the most. They're basically being wiretapped by this point because Laura and Justo are cooperating, right, with investigations. I think that's how we have these. We know all of this, and then Patrick says, "It's not just a matter of money, Laura. It's a matter of my future, my life. I won't ever be able to do deals anywhere because of all this, okay?" And then, "My assets have been confiscated. I've nothing at the moment. Do you think I'm living the sweet life? I'm borrowing money left and right to pay my bills, to pay my kids' school. That's what my life's like at the moment." So that was really him in the moment of getting found out and his panic. It all went from living this high life to realizing that the sort of jaws of justice were closing in on him. But that was in 2016. It's a long time between that and this finally getting sentenced, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. But these things do take time. I do think, though, these two, especially Tariq, though Tariq is really the villain of the story, but they were so involved throughout the scandal. So the stealing of the money is one crime. But it's always, like they say, the cover-up is worse than the crime itself. The stuff that happened, like Tariq Obaid was directly advising Najib on what to do and how to, make things right. Because what happened with Najib was he is obviously a conspirator in all of this. And there's no doubt of his involvement. But in reality is he didn't get to know the full picture of how involved he was until things started coming out. Then he started to realize what Jho was doing, this kind of completely reckless, crazy stuff. And then suddenly he was in the position where he had to make it go away, even though he didn't quite know. He knew there was shady stuff going on, but he didn't quite know how it was working, So he really needed Tariq in a big way to help him with the Saudi problem. How do we make this into a real donation? Even though at that point everyone knew there was no, the majority of that money was not a donation, So, and then also with Xavier, they didn't pay this guy, they fired him, and then he became a disgruntled former employee and ended up turning into a whistleblower. But, it's just so amazing because they'd be so desperate to control him that it looks like they paid bribes in Thailand to have the police arrest him. And when he was in prison, if you read Xavier Justo's own book about this is where it's the strongest. It's his own tale of what happened to him. The prison was in on the, keeping him under control, keeping him under lock and key. And then they flew in this British private investigator who pretended to be a agent of the British law enforcement and told him everything would be fine. all he had to do was sign right here, and it says, I did everything, and I'm evil, and I made it up, and whatever, and then he'll be free. So he signed the paperwork under this sort of false pretenses. And then it turned out that it wasn't true. Like, he wasn't free, So, and he only got out because of intervention from the Swiss government to say, like, there's something not right here. But it's like all the cover-up stuff is so much worse than the actual crime.
Well, but I still want to sort of get into why it took so long, though. I mean, I know we don't have an answer to it, but Najib went to jail a few years ago now. The Prime Minister of Malaysia went to jail in a country where we didn't really expect him to go to jail. In Singapore, Jho Low took over a Swiss bank, which is another story entirely. This bank called BSI, and a lot of employees of that bank ended up helping him facilitate movements of money around the world. Those guys all went to jail years ago now. Actually, they're all out of jail already. Meanwhile, while we're sort of ready to sort of forget this scandal, Switzerland finally jails somebody. It's just mind-boggling to me. And then at the same time, the one other piece of this that's still outstanding is that the Goldman partner, Tim Leissner, who's admitted to helping steal $200 million from 1MDB, is also not yet sentenced in America. So these are like the things that just taken forever to
all the low-level guys were the quickest ones to convict because they could just find a very simple mistake or sorry, not mistake, a very simple crime to attach to them. And but these other ones are more complicated. We have to go through thousands of paperwork, and they also, like, people like Tariq Obaid still controls a lot of money. He converted a lot of cash into jewelry. He famously bought this like crazy yellow diamond. I think it was for $10 million. Named it after his mom, and the guy's got a $10 million diamond hidden in the house somewhere or wherever in Switzerland. So I think they could defend themselves so much better than like a low-level banker who just got completely crushed by the investigators. And also there was this turnover of the prosecutors and that sort of thing too. So I think it does feel like a long time, but the good news of it is somebody like Tariq may have to go to prison. It's with these kinds of things so often, you find that the top people never go to prison,
Yeah, so what you've explained is that they're able to pay very expensive lawyers to throw a wrench in the works and make the judicial process work much slower. And that's just how it always happens, right? Meanwhile, we should just finish by discussing Rick Haythornthwaite. He was I think he might be the chairman of NatWest in Britain right now. And he was the chairman of Petro Saudi. So obviously we should preface all of this by saying Rick Haythornthwaite says he knew nothing about the corruption that went on at Petro Saudi, and where did he work before? British Petroleum BP, I think, before joining Petro Saudi. So he came on to this Petro Saudi company that did nothing, and was offered millions in bonuses. I don't know whether he was paid them, but we definitely saw the paperwork to that effect. And then, left later. But he stayed on a long time, didn't he, Rick Haythornthwaite, claiming he knew nothing about what was going on. But it strikes me as a very strange situation.
Well, yeah, ever since, there's a great story about this in the FT from Michael Peel and a few other people about this. He said, I just did an hour here and there for them consulting. But the contract that the FT got a hold of said he was agreed to work, I think, 2.5 days per week and on all these different things. Very expansive involvement. And the other thing that he did was Claire Rucastle Brown, again, wrote an email to him saying, what are you doing? This is part of this company? And he wrote back this very dismissive letter to her. So Not only did he do more than he says he did, he also purposefully turned his look the other way and rather than following up on a whistleblower,
Yeah, it's a shocking situation. Best case scenario for Rick Haythornthwaite is that he was the chairman of a fraudulent company where he didn't know anything that was going on in the company, because he must say that, and that's what he's saying is the case. So he knew nothing of what was going on, but he was paid hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds to do that role. Why? That's just makes a mockery of the corporate system. And then when all of this happens, he doesn't stand down immediately. He doesn't believe the people who are reporting on it. And then eventually when he does stand down, he says, well, look, I really didn't know anything was going on. And then NatWest appoints him as chairman. And I've seen an article in the British press in the last week questioning that decision. Why would somebody who had failed so poorly in his board duties at Petro Saudi then be, put at the top of a company like NatWest. So it's an extraordinary coda to the whole thing.
I think you'll find throughout 1MDB, there's lots of people who had no idea that all this money was stolen, but they still managed to keep it. And I have to say, that includes Pharrell Williams, Kim Kardashian, Paris Hilton, many law firms that essentially laundered money for Jho Low. And they all just had no idea that this was a fraud, and yet they managed to pocket huge fees. So there's a lot of that going on. I think, unfortunately, this is what greed does. It makes you very myopic in what you're looking at. You don't want it to be true, And this was Jho's true talent, was making everybody a collaborator. And even today in Malaysia, the case is controversial on all sides of the political spectrum because he did so much money into so many different people's lives, whether it's gifts or investments or whatever it is. He was very open with spending that money to ensure that money was hard to take back. And so that's what we're seeing with all these cases, It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and we should be clear to say, look, I mean, if you're a Pharrell Williams and you're taking money like that to do a job, that's very different to, obviously, if you're a conspirator. We're not lumping everyone into the same boat, right? But basically, people who operated with Jho Low didn't ask any questions about him, and for sure, everyone who was around him knew he was shady and had questions about it when they weren't, taking money from him. So that's the thing here. Fascinating story. We will continue probably for the rest of our lives to follow the entrails of this saga that will never end. Thanks for joining me, Bradley, on another edition of Whale Hunting.
That's it for this week. If you want to keep up with our latest work on 1MDB and a whole host of other stories, make sure to check out our website at whalehunting.projectbrazen.com, where you can subscribe to our newsletter. We also put a link to our book about Jho Low and 1MDB, Billion Dollar Whale, in the show notes for this episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back next week for more.
Whale Hunting is a production of Project Brazen. It's hosted by me, Tom Wright, and Bradley Hope. It's produced by Megan Dean, Claire Urban, and Arnav Binaikia. At Project Brazen, Mariangel Gonzalez is our project manager, and Charlie Barlow is associate producer. Ryan Ho is the creative director, with additional design from Andrea Claridge.